Larry Abraham has continued to provide the readers of his monthly newsletter, Insider Report, with analysis they just don't receive anywhere else. Today he will discuss how goes the New World Order, problems or progress. Like him or hate him, Larry will make you think. Would you welcome one of our regular speakers of this conference, Mr. Larry Abraham.
Thank you, Eric. Somebody commented that Eric and I ran into the same weed eater, and probably true. Well, for years speaking at this conference and others, I've had people come up to me after my speeches and say, well, this is an investment conference, Mr. Abraham. Why did you spend so much time talking about politics? Well, if there was ever an abject lesson in why politics needs to be discussed at an investment conference, I would think that this week may have made that point quite succinctly, particularly geopolitics. In my newsletter, which I think most of you received in your registration packet, I talk about why I believe now, after having spent most of an adult life discussing it, writing about it, researching it, that the New World Order, as we understood it, and as I explained it in my books, is for all intents and purposes now kaput. That's the good news. The bad news is that it has been replaced with something called transgovernmentalism. And I'm going to let you read that, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it tonight because I don't want to retrace that ground, except to say that the whole idea of liberal internationalism, as it was originally envisioned by John Ruskin, the British Round Table Group as far back as 1885, and then transplanted into the United States immediately following, well, actually with the election of Woodrow Wilson in 1912 and the establishment of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, and then later on the creation of the Council on Foreign Relations following World War I in 1921. All of that idea, that liberal international idea of surrendering sovereignty to either the League of Nations when in its inception or the United Nations, has now come a cropper. And the man who was most succinctly grilled and groomed to carry out that game plan, George Bush, when he announced the New World Order in a joint session of Congress, was in effect announcing its demise. But, as I said, that is the good news. Today, in the world we live in, because of the increased capability of high technology, telecommunications, the world is definitely linked. We found out just this last week that when Hong Kong catches a cold, the United States can sneeze. For years it had been said that when the United States gets a cold, the rest of the world will sneeze. But now we know that when you start taking a look at things that can affect your investment strategies, the geopolitical scene worldwide is an integral part of those considerations that you must make and that you must understand. Because if you don't, you can get blindsided. I think 2 weeks ago, as recently as 2 weeks ago, had you taken the most bearish gurus and prognosticators on markets and set them down in a room together and asked any one of them what they felt might be the trigger to send the Dow Jones into a 500-plus tailspin on a given day, not one of them would have said Hong Kong. It's always the law of unintended consequences that sneaks up on you. And so let's take a look at the world today. Let's make a quick trip around the world and see what is actually going on there, where are the dangers and the opportunities. And let's start with Europe. Now, of course, the overriding issue in Europe has to do with the creation of the euro, the common currency, the United States of Europe. And for a long time, many people, including this speaker, felt that that probably wouldn't happen. Now it appears it's going to happen regardless of whether Europe, in its individual components, is ready or not. The politicians will have their way. They are going to drive the European Union into existence regardless of how the people of Europe feel about it. And in just last week's Economist, the polls show that in overwhelming numbers the people of Europe are not for it. But it's going to happen now, it appears. Then the question has to be asked, if it does come on scheduled on January 1st, 1999, what does that do to the world geopolitically, particularly from a monetary sense? Does the euro become the single most important component, reserve currency in at least the European sphere of influence over the dollar? What happens if it doesn't hold together? What are the ramifications of creating that house of cards and then it all falling down? Would that affect you in Keokuk, Iowa and Biloxi, Mississippi? Without doubt. The situation in Europe is certainly fluid and certainly far from what one would call a common consensus on anything. The cornerstone of the New World Order for Europe was to be Germany, particularly with the creation of the Trilateral Commission. It was to be Germany in the European sphere of influence, the United States in the Western Hemisphere, and Japan in Far East. But in spite of the stock market in Germany, the social problems that are building in that country are monumental. And in spite of throwing billions of dollars at the East German problem, it continues to be a problem. And then there's the other great big joker in the European deck, the migrant Islamic population, particularly as it now exists in France and in the Club Med countries. So in spite of all the talk of the euro and the coming together and the new European man, the problems in Europe are immediate and real, and they affect us. In Africa, well, how long are we going to be looking at Africa with optimistic eyes? It seems like every 20 years there's some new reason for optimism in Africa, only to have it dashed. Some of us from this podium, myself included, were quite pessimistic about what was going to happen in South Africa once the Mandela government took power. Well, really, having just been in Africa in the last year, I would say that my pessimism was both unjustified and understated. Unjustified in one sense, but understated in an entirely different sense, in that now you have a condition where what had been the economic powerhouse for the continent anxiously awaits, and when I say anxiously, I'm talking about fear and loathing rather than delight, the successor to Mandela. And what does that mean in South Africa? Just this last week, Mandela went up and embraced Muammar Gaddafi in Libya. What are the ramifications of that? They don't bode well. And having been in Africa, as I said, in just the last year, I can tell you that in spite of all the happy faces you can put on an economic scenario for South Africa, the country in many places is becoming ungovernable. Crime in the major cities makes the South Bronx look like a Sunday afternoon picnic spot. Johannesburg, Pretoria, Durban. even at the outskirts of the Cape, it's not a pretty picture. And if you take a look at Africa generally, it's easy for us to kind of turn a blind eye to the pillaging and the plundering and the genocide and the hurt and the agony that's going on in that country or in that continent. But we cannot. And if you want to know where the trouble spots are in Africa, it's simple. Just get out a current map and look wherever the straight lines are. Wherever there's a straight line, you knew it was drawn by a politician. And when lines are drawn by politicians, they do not take into consideration such important things as tribal animosities. Sooner or later, when you discuss Africa, every aspect of your discussion has to get down to tribal considerations. And where does it go? But I think it would be redundant for me to spend a great deal of time talking about problems in Africa. Asia. Well, the Asian miracle. Little tarnished, wouldn't you say? Japan, as I said, which was to be the cornerstone for the trilateral New World, is probably the biggest basket case of all. Because it has a layer of government and bureaucracy on it that the other countries of Asia, East Asia, and Southeast Asia do not have. And let me cast a note of optimism. I don't know what's going to happen in the Hong Kong market tomorrow, or Jakarta on Tuesday, or Bangkok on Wednesday, or Kuala Lumpur on Thursday. I don't know. But one thing I do know, productivity in that part of the world is going to ratchet up year after year after year, and the reason is because they are not plagued by big government. Big government is not the problem in Southeast Asia. It's not even the problem in Hong Kong. And when you start looking for what is it that is going to drive those economies, it's the same thing that drives any economy. People want to live in nice houses, drive cars, and eat meat. It's really that simple. And now with CNN and DirecTV and the rest of the world looking wantonly at the United States and all of its consumer goods, the drive there is going to be irrepressible. When you hear all of the moaning and groaning and the RS, or the rest in peace, eulogies for Africa, just remember the same people were telling you after the tequila effect in Mexico that it would be years before that market would come back. That's not true. The greatest effect in the world today is what is going on in what I call the fourth force. Those countries that nobody anticipated being a big part of the geopolitical scene. In 1973, the year that the Trilateral Commission was formed, for example, to build the world into these hegemons of influence, who then could have looked and said, well, Taiwan will have percentage-wise the highest reserve position in the world as it relates to its monetary condition? Who then would have said that Indonesia would be growing at a 6 to 9% compounded rate and do it for 15, 20 years in a row? Who then would have looked to Chile and said it will be the economic model that will be utilized by emerging markets around the world? Nobody. But that fourth force, incorporated in countries like those I just named, that is part of the geopolitical consideration, ladies and gentlemen, that has to be part of your investment considerations. And in Chile, the country of my current residence, there you have probably the most dramatic examples of what happens to a philosophy put into practice. The philosophy I'm talking about there is one that many conservatives and libertarians have been talking about for years. What happens if you privatize Social Security? I'll tell you what happens. You create the largest saving rate in the world, which Chile now has, percentage-wise. And that savings rate is represented in its private pension plans. And when you take a look at the markets last week, you saw the Brazilian market down 16% one day, Buenos Aires down 14%, Mexico off 15%, Hong Kong off 20%. The Chilean market, on its worst day last week, budged 4% down. Why? Because of the pension plans. The pension plan represent 40% of that market. They weren't going anywhere. They couldn't. And you have a similar situation now in the United States, in the mutual funds, as it relates to a buffer on the market. I have been bearish on this market generally because of the valuations that Jim talked about. Bearish at the price-earnings ratios and the low dividend yields. But there's one thing that we may have overlooked. And it was the Chilean pension plans that got me to thinking about it. The greatest buffer to this market in the United States is the mutual funds. And for years I saw that as a potential problem. When they all tried to get through the same hole in the gate at the same time, what would happen? But today, in the mutual funds in the United States, it represents half of the total capitalization of the New York Stock Exchange and probably half of the highly traded stocks on NASDAQ and probably half of the equally highly traded stocks on the American Stock Exchange. And what happens when you've got that sort of diversification? No margin calls. Remember, what triggers collapses in the markets, not the first wave of selling. It's the first wave that triggers the margin calls, which trigger the collapse. I was making calls all day Tuesday, trying to find out how many margin calls had gone out from the major brokerage houses. Almost none. Because the individual investors were not that highly leveraged. And the mutual funds, all 8,500 of them, 3 times more than all the stocks listed on the New York Stock Exchange, didn't have 1 penny in margin. That's why that market didn't continue down Tuesday, and that's why once there was a turnaround signal flashed on Tuesday morning with IBM and Boeing, bango, the liquidity was there. The Widow Jones didn't ask for the check. The Widow Jones money had been sitting there ready to be a buyer. Now, does that mean that this is going to create a perpetual bull market? No, I do not believe that. But I don't think this market will die with a bang. In fact, I don't think it will die at all. It will correct, but each new high will be lower than the previous high, and each new low will be a little deeper than the previous low. Because nobody who's a mutual fund investor is going to turn bearish overnight. Even if they did, they stop being contributors to their fund first. They stop being buyers first before they become sellers. That's a very, very important point. And we saw that dramatically evidenced just this last week in the difference between what went on in Chile, although they don't have mutual funds of the type we're talking about here. You have 5 million people in a country of 14 million all invested in their private pension plans who didn't want to go anywhere come Tuesday morning. Now throughout the hemisphere, in Argentina, Bolivia, Peru, Salvador, those same models that created the Chilean economic miracle are now being put into place. And their importance cannot be overlooked. If you're looking for what is, in my opinion, the country now down there to be looking to, it's Argentina. Because not only are they adopting those sorts of reforms, but they do not have a high currency risk because the Argentine peso is tied directly to the dollar. The higher risk country down there right now would be Brazil. But even there, it's a whole new ballgame. And the New World Order is not demanding or creating the criteria by which Brazil will continue ahead with its privatizations, as will Argentina, as will the rest of them. So you see, these geopolitical considerations are very much a part of our daily consideration. Now let's talk about the United States. I gave a speech at this conference 3 years ago, I believe it was, why the United States could not lead the world. I was wrong. The United States can lead the world for one reason. The United States has learned to live with impotent political leadership. Bill Clinton's greatest contribution to the United States economy is ineptitude. And the American people's greatest contribution to their whole system is that they no longer look to government to solve their problems. Would any rational person look to Bill and Hillary and Al and Tipper to solve their problems? I think not. But that's a lesson that had to be learned. And since living outside the United States, I see this dramatically evident. The United States is a great country because it has a great people. Government abuse be damned. It's a great country. The United States can lead. And the United States is leading now. We saw that Tuesday morning too, didn't we? The whole world was waiting for the United States to provide the leadership Tuesday morning. Didn't make any difference what happened in Britain or Germany and all their pomposity and posturing and viewing with alarm and pointing with pride. No. It was the United States that everybody was looking to. And since living out of the country, I've come to have an appreciation for the United States that I could never have gotten if I spent the rest of my life living here. Americans are a hard-working people. You're a competitive lot. And the rest of the world looks to you for that reason. American corporations, they may get behind the curve for a while, but it won't be long. Their competitiveness is driving the world to higher levels of productivity than it could possibly ever have imagined. Now, I'm not saying that everything in the United States is hunky-dory, but the most important thing about the United States is that it works. And the fact that it keeps on working in the face of government abuse and high tax levels and bureaucratic interference and political bumbling makes it and gives it its primary strength. The fact that it continues to provide the leadership both in the business and in the ideological world is a testimony to American ingenuity. And as I said, the greatest thing about America in the last 4 years, in my opinion, is that the American people have learned to live without government. Now, the fact that you are abused by government, well, that's the subject of another speech. But this country is strong, and I think because it has learned that lesson, it is going to get even stronger. And as long as this country stays on that high level of competitiveness, and as long as the American people keep looking away from government as the solution to problems and look to within themselves and their own businesses and their own companies as the source of solutions to their problems, the country's going to do quite well, in spite of all the obvious problems. So, as we view the whole geopolitical world, we can no longer be parochial and provincial. It doesn't work anymore. There was a time when it did. There was a time when it didn't really make any difference. When the major corporations in the United States had 85 to 90% of their sales consumed by the American people, it really didn't make any difference. But now, when the nifty 50 and the high flyers, those companies that are the leaders that everybody's looking to, are looking at 40, 50, 60% of their sales components to the rest of the world, then our provincialism can be very costly. Yes, this last week was a gut check, and there will be others. And it's easy for the gurus on CNBC and CNN-FN to say, well, this is a buying opportunity. But you know what? It really can be. It really can be. If you're taking a look at the buying opportunity in relation to the geopolitical considerations and how they affect the stock of the company you're considering on buying. You're not buying markets unless you're using puts and calls on the derivatives. Most of the time, you're stock pickers. And it doesn't make any difference which sector of the economy you are picking your stock. How that stock is going to be affected in the emerging and the real geopolitical world you're living in day to day, month to month, will determine on whether or not your stock pick was a good one. Let me give you a couple of specifics right now. Argentina Telephone. Telefonis Argentina. They're two different companies. YPF Argentina, the oil giant. Telebras, the Brazilian telecommunications company. And yes, Enersys, the Chilean electric utility, which, as the readers of my Insider Report know, I've been battling with the last month. And yes, Insider Report readers, I can go in and out of the country without the fear of being thrown into a Chilean jail. Because we won. We beat them. The entire board of directors of Enersys has been thrown out. And that, to me, spells good news for buying that stock of that company. Because these master of the universe attitudes are no longer going to be prevailing and overhanging the price of that stock. And let's take a look at Hong Kong. You cannot lose in the next 10 years, and let me add, you cannot be an international speculator with a short-term time horizon. But you cannot lose over the next 10 years with Hong Kong Tel and China Power and Light. You cannot. The consumption numbers are just too great. They have no way to go but up. And yes, that market has sent a lot of money to money heaven, as Doug Casey calls it. But you don't know wealth until you see Asian wealth. And the productivity isn't going to grind to a halt. So when we see these gut checks, when we see these hiccups, or even earthquakes, if we have a geopolitical eye fixed on productivity, it will provide incredible investment opportunities. Ladies and gentlemen, let me conclude my comments by just saying that in the United States today, you have a condition that is truly unique. in the whole world. You have something that should never, ever be given short shrift. You have a heritage that says individuals count, the state counts for very little, and you have a document that proves it. It's called the Bill of Rights. I didn't really realize how important that was until I was sued criminally in Santiago by some thieves for defaming them. In an atmosphere where you are innocent till proven guilty, no matter how many times you may see that particular justice system found wanting, never forget that it is unique. It makes the United States something terribly different, and it makes the United States a leader in the world. And the fact that we've now learned to live in this country without having political leadership as the major consideration for our providing leadership to the rest of the world is, in my opinion, the greatest thing that's happened in the 24 years that Jim Blanchard's been holding this conference. Good night. Thank you.